Wow. Hello. This is the quietest crowd ever. Usually, the hardest part of my remarks are getting people's attentions because everyone's usually so excited to be here and has come with friends and family. So, thank you. I guess for folks who have come out today, braved the elements, fit this in before the Super Bowl, you're determined to hear the program. So we're very glad to, I'm Susan Abrams, CEO at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and I'm so glad to welcome you here for our debut of the very wonderful, meaningful, and important exhibition, Speak Truth to Power. I'd like to welcome you not only on my own behalf, but on behalf of the museum family, which includes our board of directors, represented today by quite a number of folks, but I'll call out Jeff Pfeffer, our chairman of the board, also by our wonderful staff. And here I will call out our exhibitions team led by Ariel Weininger, our chief curator, who did such a beautiful job with her team and with our Vice President of Education and Exhibitions, Shoshana Buchholz-Miller, in interpreting for our space the phenomenal exhibition. So we're thrilled with the way it has come to be, and so proud to be able to share that with you. Also, on behalf of our almost 400 volunteers, docents and visitor services volunteers who make things happen around here every single day, and of course our cherished survivor community. So, and also U.S. Representative Brad Schneider and his wife Julie, who have joined us today. How many of you have been here before? Fantastic. How many of you have been through our Take a Stand Center? Okay, so quite a number, but not quite as many. I hope today you'll also have a chance, in addition to going through Speak Truth to Power, to also visit Take a Stand Center, which is conveniently located right next door. There are the two galleries immediately to my right, your left. And for those of you who are new to our museum, we use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to inspire our visitors to become upstanders as opposed to bystanders. We use that word throughout our museum, upstanders as opposed to bystanders, recognizing the power of their voices and choices to affect change in our world. Our motto can be simplified from remember the past to remember the past, transform the future. And so the Take a Stand Center helps us now to do that in such a moving way. With the Take a Stand Center, our first gallery, you have the interactive holographic survivor stories experience, where you can not only learn about a survivor, but actually have a real conversation with a recorded holographic image of a survivor. So to the extent that you haven't seen that too, I highly recommend that to you. And then from there, we bridge via the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is so critical to the Speak Truth to Power exhibition, and you'll see it displayed as part of that exhibition, as well as in Take a Stand Center. We bridge from the Holocaust to our world today because, as most of you probably know, the Declaration enumerates those rights that we should all be entitled to, regardless of who we are. But what we learn and know too is that that document, while much progress has been made, is still aspirational, and so it takes all of us working together to make our world a better place. Take a Stand Center and Speak Truth to Power really are what this institution is all about. And the Speak Truth to Power exhibition, put together by Kerry and her team, based on her book that she spent, I think it was 2+ years, doing the interviews and research for, are the message that we try to share every day with our 60,000 students and educators who come through annually, as well as with the tens of thousands more who are reaching beyond our wall. We work on these themes as well, and the rights of individuals balanced against the needs of our fragile democracy, with all Chicago Police Department recruits who come here for training, as well as those who are being promoted to sergeant and lieutenant. So it is infused also in our public programs. We use our special exhibitions to either go deeper into aspects of the Holocaust or broader into other areas of social justice and human rights. As you'll see, some of the upstanders who are featured, and Kerry calls them defenders of human rights, there's an overlap between Take a Stand and Speak Truth to Power, and that is something that we should expect, and it's wonderful to see them in different lenses as they're presented. This exhibition would not be possible without, of course, the very generous support of many of you in this room, as well as the David C. and Sarah Jean Ruttenberg Arts Foundation, the Illinois Arts Council, and the Golder Family Foundation, which is a lead sponsor for all of our museum special exhibitions. I'd also like to thank our media sponsors, Chicago Magazine and WBEZ. And with that, I'm going to tell you just a tiny bit about the Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer whose work is showcased in Speak Truth to Power. Eddie Adams was the winner of the 1969 Pulitzer Prize and recipient of more than 500 international, national, and local awards, and is one of the most decorated and published photographers in America. His photographs have been seen on the covers of front pages of international publications, including Time, Newsweek, New York Times, Paris Match, Parade, Vanity Fair, and so many others. He has created portraits of worldwide leaders, including Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, Bush, Reagan, and Clinton, and more than 50 heads of state. Kerry may tell you a little bit more about him. One of the things for which he is most famous, however, is his coverage of the ravages of 13 wars, 13. In Vietnam, he went on more than 150 operations, and in 1968, he photographed the indelible picture of the Saigon police chief. Probably as I'm saying this, the image is coming into your minds. The Saigon police chief shooting a Viet Cong prisoner at point blank range, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize. In 1977, his photographs of the boat people escaping Vietnam contributed to Congress's decision to admit 200,000 Vietnamese to America. So that's a little bit of introduction, and now it's really my privilege to introduce one of the world's great upstanders, a warrior in her own right, traveling the globe without stop to defend human rights. And she'll tell you more about the many ways that she does that, bringing our legal system, the economy, business, so many different aspects, levers to defend human rights herself and bring these stories to the fore. Kerry Kennedy is the president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. She is the author of Speak Truth to Power, Human Rights Defenders Who Are Changing Our World, and that is the book that she wrote upon which this exhibition is based. Also the author of bestseller Being Catholic Now, Change in the Church and the Quest for Meaning, and the upcoming If We Fail to Dare, Robert F. Kennedy and Those He Inspired, which should be out in May of 2018. For more than 35 years, Kerry has devoted herself to the pursuit of equal justice, the promotion and protection of basic rights, and the preservation of the rule of law. She has worked on a range of issues, including children's rights, child labor, disappearances, indigenous land rights, judicial independence, freedom of expression, ethnic violence, and the environment. She has concentrated specifically on women's rights, exposing injustices, and educating audiences about women's issues, particularly honor killings, sexual slavery, domestic violence, workplace discrimination, sexual assault, abuse of prisoners, and more. She has led hundreds of human rights delegations. Under Kerry's leadership, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights partners with the bravest people on earth to create lasting change. Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights supports defenders in the field, and I know we'll hear more, with advocacy, litigation, and training, trains the next generation of human rights defenders with its Speak Truth to Power curriculum, and engages the financial community about sustainable investing and the intersection between business and human rights. She serves on so many boards that I'm not going to list them or share them because we'd be here all day, and she's waving me on. So with that, maybe too long introduction. The bottom line is we're so thrilled to have Kerry here to share some remarks with all of you, and then we'll open up for questions. So Kerry, come on up. Okay, I know, but I'm so proud and I want to share everything. There's so much to say.
Oh my God.
And here's some water and everything right there.
Thank you. How great is Susan Abrams? We love her so much. Susan, I know you all have been here before, but what an amazing exhibit. And that Holocaust program is just extraordinary, so moving. I'm so happy to be with you. And the Abrams family, who's like, I think, one of the best friends of the Kennedy family. So I'm so happy to be with all of you. Congressman, there you are, Brad. Thank you so much for coming. And we were together on the Civil Rights Tour with Congressman John Lewis a couple of years ago, and so good to be with you. And with so many others. Lee Shapiro, such a good friend, and so many others. But so I thought I'd talk a little bit about, I was told not to lean on this thing. Now I know why. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I became involved in human rights and a little bit about Speak Truth to Power and some of the defenders in the book and that are in the exhibit. Is that good? Okay, and then let's have a dialogue after if that's okay with you. So first of all, how I became involved in human rights. Well, I have 7 brothers and 3 sisters. I'm the 7th of 11. It makes you appreciate human rights at a very young age. My youngest memories are when my father was Attorney General during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And when I learned to tie my shoes, I made sure if I put my left one on first, I tied my right one first, because I didn't want there to be discrimination. And when I was a kid, so we used to go down and visit my father at the Justice Department. My mother would take 6 or 7 kids, and she always had a convertible. She'd put us in the back of the convertible. And is that Chris? Oh, my brother Chris is here. Hi, Chris. Thanks for coming. Thanks. Yeah. So so she would take 6 or 7 of us and a couple of dogs and a football and put us into the back of her convertible and drive us down to see my father at the Justice Department. And he had this enormous office, like almost the length of this room. And it was actually a hallway, but he chose that office so he could throw the football in it. But we'd like to visit him, and then we loved to go down in the bottom of the Justice Department is a tunnel, and you can walk through that tunnel over to the FBI building. And we used to do that and watch the sharpshooters at practice, which we loved to do. And now the head of the FBI at that time was J. Edgar Hoover, who was not known for his sense of humor or his love of children. And so, anyway, and this is the weird part of the story. There was a suggestion box in the bottom of the FBI building. So one day we were over there watching the sharpshooters, and my mother took out her red pen and wrote a little suggestion and put it into that box. And then when she was gathering all of us and bringing us, and the dogs and the football and everything, and trying to bring us back up to Daddy's office, a very astute FBI spy, well, FBI worker, went and took that suggestion and brought it up to J. Edgar Hoover, who immediately had it sent over to Daddy's office. So when we walked into his office, he was reading the suggestion and it read, "Get a new director." Yeah. So it was an early lesson in the importance of speaking truth to power. So one time when we went over to see my father, he wrote me a letter, and I still have it on my wall, and it says, "Dear Kerry, today was a historic day, not just because of your visit, but because 2 African Americans were allowed to register at the University of Alabama. And it happened just a few moments ago over the objections of the governor. And I hope these events are long past by the time you get your pretty little head to college. Love and kisses, Daddy." And a lot happened between the day that he wrote that letter and I went off to college about 16 years later. And Chris and I had an amazing childhood, an idyllic childhood, something that anybody on earth would love, pray for to give their children. But there were a series of chaotic, crazy events, and they took something that was so wonderful, and they made it really, really hard, really hard. And so the first, as you know, is my uncle was killed when I was 4. And then 4 years later, when Daddy was running for president, exactly 50 years ago this year, we lost Martin Luther King, and then 6 weeks later, we lost my father. And I was 8 years old at that time. A lot of people came to the aid of our family, but when you lose a parent at that age, it leaves the work of love undone, and that can never be done by somebody else. I was in 3rd grade. When I was in 5th grade, a girl came to me who was my age and whose family was at our house all the time. And she said, "My father's beating up my mother." And I just did not know what to do with that. I didn't know how to protect the girl. I didn't know if it was a secret. I didn't know if I could tell my mother. I didn't know how to protect this woman who I loved. I didn't know how to think about the man who was beating her up, who I also loved and was at our house all the time. And it was so crazy making. It was so hard to figure that out. And then when I was in high school, 2 of my best friends were raped. And that, again, was a big secret. Don't tell any of the adults. So we're trying to figure out, what do you do? And how do you grapple with the fallout? And then one of my friends was one of the first people in the United States to die from HIV/AIDS. And he was gay and he wasn't out of the closet. So I tell you those stories not to feel sorry for me, and God forbid, after walking through this exhibit, but to say, all of us have those stories. Everybody in this room has those stories. And the 2 things that are a part of every human being's experience is suffering and then love. And those are things that were in my experience. But I was so confused by these. And then I spent a summer working at Amnesty International, and I was documenting abuses committed by US immigration officials against refugees from El Salvador, and this is about 1979. And the immigration issues were not in any newspaper at that time. So this was all new, shocking information. And while I was working at Amnesty, somebody handed me a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I read that document, and it changed my life. And I suddenly realized that all the crazy, insane, chaotic things that were so hard in my life had one thing in common. They were all violations of international human rights. And in each case, I could use that document and learn from my colleagues at Amnesty International and other human rights organizations how to use that document to stop those violations and to make sure that they wouldn't happen to me or to the people I loved or to people in my community or my country or other places around the world. And that's that day I turned from somebody who felt like a victim to somebody who felt like an activist. And I found an agency, and I could make a difference. I have to tell you something. You got to walk through this exhibit, not speak truth to power. I hope you do that too, but what is it called? Take a stand. That's what this exhibit is all about. You go and you listen to that hologram, you learn about the Holocaust, and then you walk into the... I was saying this to Susan before. I've been to a lot of civil rights museums around the world and Holocaust museums all over the world, and others in other countries for their massive violations. And this exhibit is so amazing because it takes you through the hell, but it really, really, really shows kids how they can make a difference. And so leaves you feeling like there's a path forward. I can create change. It's so empowering. So I just want to say that. Yeah, way to go. So I took that the reading of the International Declaration, and I thought, I want to tell the stories of these human rights defenders, and I want to do it in a way that's empowering to people. Because when you said at that time, if I said, oh, I work in human rights, people would say, oh, that's nice, and then they'd walk across the room, give me a vodka, let me out of here. Because they didn't want to hear about the pain and the torture and the horror of it. But that was the opposite of my experience with it, because I was working with the bravest people on earth, people who face imprisonment and torture and death for basic rights most of us are lucky enough to take for granted. So just so when you think about what would it be like to work with Mahatma Gandhi, or what do you think about working with Martin Luther King, the first thing that comes to mind is not somebody who's stuck in a jail in Birmingham, but somebody who's spiritual and hopeful and gives you a sense of a vision of a more just and peaceful world. And that was my experience, and that's what I want to share, and people who are actually creating change, successfully creating change. So I spent 2.5 years, and I interviewed all of these extraordinary people, and that was written, I wrote this into a book, and then this photo exhibit that you'll see in the other room. And there are people like Elie Wiesel, who said, my dream for the future is that your children won't have my past. And there are people like Archbishop Tutu, who said, we don't have God who says, ah, gotcha. We have a God who lifts us up and dusts us off and tells us to try it again. And to me, those are the bookends of human rights. On the one hand, trying to stop the atrocities, and on the other hand, having this faith in the capacity of the human spirit to triumph even under the worst of circumstances. And I don't know, shall I tell you about one of the other defenders? So somebody asked me about Digna Ochoa earlier today. So Digna Ochoa is one of the defenders, and she was a woman, she was a nun, and she was indigenous person, and she was a leading human rights lawyer in Mexico. And I asked her why she became involved in human rights, and she said that she had grown up in a small village, and there was only one factory in the town, and her father was a union organizer for the factory, and whenever he would organize a strike, the owner of the factory, instead of talking to the workers, would just call the police, and the police would come and round up all the union activists and torture them and throw them in jail. And she said, you know, there was no lawyer who could take our case, so I want to become a lawyer. And I said, well, tell me about a typical case. And she said, well, so a woman came to our office a couple weeks ago and said that her husband had been disappeared and that there was a rumor he was in a military hospital. So I said, so what'd you do? She said, well, I went to the military hospital, but they wouldn't let me in. So she said she stood outside until there was a shift change and she walked past the guards. And she said she walked upstairs to the second floor and she looked around and there was only one room that had a nurse standing outside it. So she went over to that room and the nurse said, you can't go in there. I can't even go in there. The desaparecido is in there. So she's like, okay, I know where my client is. And she said, oh, I'm going in there. And she said she opened the door, and with all the authority she could muster, she said to the two guys who were, you know, who had beaten him so badly that he had to be hospitalized, you get out of here right now. This is my client, and I'm his lawyer, and I get 5 minutes alone with him. And to her shock, they left. And so she explained who she was, and the guy signed her up as a lawyer, and now she could get a habeas corpus decree from a judge. So she was feeling pretty good. So she started to walk back down the hall, and around the corner came the two guards who had obviously been reprimanded for leaving their post. And they started toward her in a very aggressive way. And I said, so what'd you do? She said, I assumed the attack position. Hey! And one of them said, you're going to attack us. And she said, take it any way you please. And they were so shocked to see a woman and a nun and an indigenous person, you know, about to attack them, that they sort of backed off, and it gave her a chance to escape. And I said to her, Digna, reflecting on that moment, what gave you the courage to walk into that hospital, to walk into that hospital room, and to confront those guards? And I don't know what I thought she would say, something about love or dignity or justice, but what she said really surprised me. She said, I was just so angry. She said, I was so angry when I thought about what they've done to me and to my family, my community, my country, and I gathered up all that outrage, and it gave me this centering force with which I could confront anyone. And I think that, you know, what Digna is saying is we have to be angry enough to speak out when we see injustice. And my father used to talk about the ancient pyramids that were built by slaves, and there's graffiti in there that's 2,000 years old that says no one was angry enough to speak out. We need to be angry enough to speak out. I think with all of these defenders, there's profound lessons that they have for all of us. The book, the exhibit, is not about victims. It's purposely about people who successfully created change in their societies. And these are not abstract concepts. These are actual, real human beings who walk among us. And I think that sometimes we sort of seal our saints in stained glass, and they're so high above us that we're no longer challenged by their lives here on earth. But these are literally living, breathing human beings who challenge each of us to find that courage within, to create change, and to make our communities and our country and our world the world that we should be, one of justice, and one of compassion. And I guess I'll just end by saying, when Daddy announced that he was running for president 50 years ago, he said, peace and justice and compassion towards those who suffer. That's what the United States should stand for. Yeah. And he said, that's why I'm running for the presidency of the United States, and that is what we need to stand for. And we can do that. We can be our best selves, and we can bring our country to be its best self. And that's really ultimately what I hope people walk away from this exhibit with. Thank you very much. So I'd be happy to answer. I think there's a mic here, but.
If people want to stand up and ask a question, that would be great.
Okay.
Or you want me to run it to you? I can do that
I
too.
believe that the United States has not signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Is that correct?
So there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we did actually sign, but you've got a good question. So that's a declaration saying this is what we believe in. And then there are two covenants. One is on political rights and one is on economic, social, and cultural rights. We signed the political covenant, but we didn't sign the economic, social, and cultural rights covenant. And there are a lot of other international agreements that have grown up in the last 70 years that have been developed, like the Declaration, the Covenant on the Rights of Children, which the United States also has not signed.
What can we do to make that happen?
Well, you know, it's interesting. On Martin Luther King Day, I heard his lawyer speak. And he said, if you don't like Trump, you should vote. So that's number one. You got to get out there and vote. And we're lucky enough to have a franchise in the United States. You got to vote. And I think that's really important. And we need to advocate specifically for some of those international laws. We need to let our legislators know that we support the United Nations. And do you support the United Nations, Brad? There we go. Thank you. So I think that we need to do that, and there's a lot of rhetoric against it. The UN was created primarily by the United States to help create a peaceful and just world, and it's insane for us not to support that. Yes?
Kerry, first, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Go, and we'll come back.
Sorry. Thank you for all you've done to turn your personal tragedy and our country's tragedy around. We met 2 weeks ago briefly at a gubernatorial candidates fundraising breakfast. I worked with your cousin Patrick for some time on issues related to mental health, trauma, recovery. I would love for you to speak about the intersection and overlap between your work on human rights and those issues that are in Patrick's domain. Second part, what do you do if the bully and human rights abuser holds the highest office in the world? Any strategies? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask, we love all questions. We're going to try to walk the line here of activism without outright political expressions in this report.
Okay, sorry. In trouble again. But no, so one of the people who's in the exhibit is called Gabor Gambash, and he is one of the leading activists on mental health issues. He has an extraordinary story. He grew up in Hungary, and it was in the Soviet system, and he was brilliant, and he was a astrophysicist, and he was kind of on his way to becoming the head of the Astrophysicist Society, which is the most important organization for people in that realm. And when he was a kid, his mother started to hear voices, and she was in and out of asylums. And then when he was about 26, 27, he started hearing voices. And he was put into an asylum 4 or 5 times. And the last time he was in it, they tried to give him the medicine that they had given to his mother and that had killed her. And so he said he refused the medication, and the doctor said to him, you're crazy, and we're the doctors, so we're going to give this to you anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so he escaped. And then he started the first organization of survivors of mental health institutions in Eastern Europe. And so a few years ago, we were at an exhibit of Speak Truth to Power in Romania, and we went to a mental health hospital, and then afterwards we went to a room that was very much like this, but with and there was a lot of press there, and so I gave my little talk about Speak Truth to Power, and I said, these are the bravest people on earth. They're the Martin Luther Kings and Mahatma Gandhis of our time. And then I talked about everything we were going to do for the next week. And I asked Gabor Gombash to come up and speak. And he gets up to the podium, and he pulls out of his pocket 2 medicine bottles. And he said, my name is Gabor Gombash, and I'm schizophrenic. And if I don't take these medicines every day, I start hearing voices, and I've been put into an asylum 5 different times. And if I told you that I'm like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, you would say, he's crazy. But because this organization gives me this podium, you're listening to me. And he said, I want you to know that our struggle in the mental health community for basic rights is no less of a civil rights struggle than that of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. And I think that, that was a very profound statement and an incredibly courageous thing for him to say. And in too much, there's so much discrimination against people with mental health issues in our country. And I'm very proud of Patrick's work on that. But in other countries, people are stripped of their rights and can never get them back, and are put in horrendous, horrific conditions, held against their will. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. There's certain groups that are working really hard on this that are terrific, but we've got a long way to go, and I'm glad you raised the issue. Yeah.
Hi. I'm here from Amherst College. I'm a student there now. And I always admired the fight that your family had for human rights and civil rights, especially as a student growing up in the state of Illinois. And I see the title of your name in your book is Speak Truth to Power. And seeing that, how can we direct, like, bringing out speaking truth, or can we direct on what is exactly the truth? Is it so much in the biblical sense? Because I'm a man of faith, belief, and is it like speaking from the biblical sense, or speaking from the fight of civil rights from the U.S. Constitution, or what of our own personal belief of what is right?
Thank you very much. Well, so when we say speak truth to power, what's the truth? How do you judge what truth is? I think that that's a struggle everybody goes through, and I think that we all have to decipher what our truth is, and advocate on on those grounds. Now, that said, there is actually a document called the International Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so these are not sort of, you know, vague concepts of right and wrong. It's a law, and it's written down, and nations have agreed to uphold it. So you can hold nations accountable for failing to uphold it. The Universal Declaration actually grew up out of the Holocaust, because before that, how a country treated its own citizens was considered to be sovereign and nobody else's business. And after the horror of the Holocaust, as many of the people in this room know, the nations of the world came together and said, there are certain rights that are so fundamental to being a human being that it doesn't matter what the government is. We all have them, and we all have an obligation to uphold them. And so that's the basis of our work. And at RFK Human Rights, should I tell you what we do? Okay, so we do three things. Everything we do starts with my father's values and vision of a more just and peaceful world. We have one division that sues governments, and we use the Universal Declaration to do that. So when Uganda passed a law that made homosexuality punishable by life in prison without parole, we partnered with human rights defenders, lawyers on the ground there. We sued the government, we overturned the law. And we do that on a wide range of issues all over the world, mostly in Latin America and in Africa. Then, if you hold governments responsible, that's important. But today, of the 100 largest economies on Earth, 50% of them are corporations. So if you're serious about human rights, you have to also be involved in corporate responsibility. Now, most people do that through the corporations, directly with the corporations themselves. But our human rights organization takes a different view. So usually when people think about supply chain, it goes from the CEO all the way down to the lowest person working on a factory line, right? Yeah. So, but we think of it as going actually up to the the CEO, to the private equity company that invests in it, and then to the investors in that private equity company. And those investors are often very closely aligned with the person at the lowest end of the supply chain. Because literally above those investors is that person on that supply chain. So let me give you an example of this. The United Auto Workers pension system might be very concerned about how, if they're investing in a company, about how that company is treating people who are trying to form a union. Right? So do you get it? Yeah. So that's who we work with. We work with the investors to try and put pressure on the companies to make sure that they're in compliance with human rights norms. The second thing we do in that area, can I just tell you one more thing? 'Cause it's so interesting. Okay, so another thing we do with the investor community is we're looking at who makes the investments. So of the 20 largest university endowments in the United States today, if you pool all the money in the endowments of the largest universities in this country, guess how much those endowments are invested by women and minority-owned firms? 1%. 1%. It's like Alabama in 1956. 1%. It is insane. So we're working on those issues as well. And then the third thing we do is, if we hold the governments responsible and we hold the corporations responsible, it's for naught unless we get the next generation engaged. And that's what we do through our Speak Truth to Power work. And this is, I mean, you're going to see the exhibit, and there's a book that goes along with it. but the bulk of that work is through a human rights education program, which is taught to about 1.2 million students each year and reaches about 5.5 million adults all over the world. So that's our work.
Kerry, you're being too modest. And some of the other great work of the Center for Human Rights and Justice, can you speak a little bit about what you're doing with the criminal justice system here in the United States, and in particular, Close Rikers Now?
Thank you. Thanks. So thanks, Lee. So we also do work here domestically, and specifically on mass incarceration, pretrial detention. So in New York, where I come from, we're engaged in an effort to close Rikers Island down, which is the largest jail in our city. And last year, the mayor finally agreed to close it down, so that was a big victory. But do you want to hear a little bit about this? I mean, this is so unbelievable. It's incredible. Okay, so when you're arrested in New York, you're brought before a judge within 48 hours. And then if you are, then the judge issues bail, okay? So if you're wealthy enough to make bail, you get to go home. And so basically everybody in this room, likely somebody in your family gets arrested, they go home. You go back to work, you go back to school, you prepare for trial, you hire a lawyer, your life goes on. If you're too poor to make bail, just because you're poor, not because of the crime you committed, just because you cannot make bail, you don't go home. You go to Rikers Island. So 80% of the people at Rikers are not adjudicated, not found guilty of any crime. They're just awaiting trial. And the only reason they're there, the only reason that separates them from the people who are not there, is their poverty. And that's how this system works in New York, and it's how the system works in most of the United States. And you know, when 50 years ago, when Daddy made that speech, we had 187,000 people in jail or in prisons in the United States. Today, we have 2.2 million at any given time. So any given day, 2.2 million people. We have 11 million going through the criminal justice system, spending at least one night in jail per year. 11 million, think about that. We have 325 million people in our country. 11 million a year spend at least one night in jail. What that does, so then you're sent to Rikers, and Rikers is an extremely dangerous place. And so the judges and the prosecutors use the dangerousness of Rikers in order to coerce people who may be innocent into taking a guilty plea just to get off of Rikers Island. And they do that by saying things like, you were picked up on a minor charge, maybe having a joint. Now, if you're in Rikers, you're going to get into a fight. Somebody's going to beat you up. And if you scratch that person, that is now a felony. And if you have a felony in a prison, we can charge you with that, and then you go to jail for 13 years. So it would be in your interest just to say you're guilty for whatever it is that we accused you of. And a lot of these are kids, and they sign. They say, okay, I'll take that. And even, you know, and a lot of adults say that too, because they need to get home, they might have family at home, they might have a job they have to return to. But what happens is, once you've said you're guilty of a crime, now it's really hard to get a job. First of all, you might have been fired from your job for not showing up already. When you go to apply for a job again, now you've got a guilty plea for a crime. very hard to get a job. Then you've spent time in jail. Now it's really hard to get a job. Then you think, well, I'll go home because I've got a 16-year-old at home in public housing. Not so fast. No longer allowed in public housing if you pled guilty to a crime. So nobody tells you that when you plead guilty. All they do is say you should plead guilty. So these are some of the injustices that we're trying to fight at RFK Human Rights. Thanks.
Oh, I do have I was wondering, in your work with corporations or against corporations, do you have anything going against the various munitions companies, the industry?
So the answer to that is yes and no. So not specifically, but we do encourage investors in corporations to invest sustainably. And munitions are arguably inherently unsustainable. So let me give you an example of this. Do you remember the Newtown massacre? Okay, a few years ago. So there are 26 kids killed and 6 teachers. So all those teachers were part of a teachers' union. That teachers' union had a pension fund. So all those teachers were involved in a pension fund. That pension fund, in turn, was investing in the company that made the semi-automatic rifle that was used to mow down those kids and their teachers. So this is the type of thing that we really want to empower consumers and pensioners to understand. That's my retirement dollars. Where is it going? Why is it going there? Is that consistent or inconsistent with my values? And what can I do about it if it's doing something that I disagree with? So think about this. If you have a foundation or a family office or something like that, if you have a nonprofit foundation, you're obligated, because I imagine people here are on boards or work with nonprofits, is that right? Some of you? Anybody? Yeah, so a bunch of you. So you under law have to use at least 5% to pursue whatever your goal is. Let's say running the Holocaust Museum. I don't want to get too close to home here, but so great, you do that and you do the programming. My question is, forget about the 5%. What's the 95% doing? What are you doing with that 95%? Do you have any idea? Do you know if that 95% is invested in a way that enhances your 5% or undermines your 5% or is neutral to it? And the answer is that very few people can answer that question, because very few people are asked to ask that question. And it's an important question to ask, because that's really where the power is. Yeah, it's in the 5%, but most of it's in the 95%. Thank you.
She's so brilliant and articulate and such a hard worker on all of our behalf. So I know I can speak for this audience in saying how grateful we are to have you here. I did get some questions as we were gathering about the book that goes with Speak Truth to Power. We have, as I understand it, just a couple copies left. If you would like, if you're interested in ordering a copy, Marcy Larson over there has a clipboard, and you can talk to Marcy. Of course, we all know you can also achieve that other ways too, but we would be very happy to assist you with that. And with that, I guess I'd like to bring the program to an end. Again, thank all of you for sharing your Sunday afternoon with us here at the museum, and thank you to Kerry.